Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this Wednesday, April 2024, just after the solar eclipse. I am Sue Schäufele from the UMass Extension Vegetable Program, and this is part of a series we've been doing with NOFA through the Transition to Organic Partnership Program on sort of fundamentals of organic production. And this one's going to be about vegetable pest management. And it's a huge topic. And I thought I could do it in an in-person morning workshop. And that was a stretch. And to do it in an hour and a half online is a stretch. So we have a little poll. Jean-Beth, if you could pop that up. Just want to get a quick sense of what folks are most interested in hearing about, whether it's sort of big picture stuff or really specific recommendations of specific pests. And my guess is that we'll get a pretty even split and everyone wants to hear about everything, which is the challenge. But I'll share a lot of resources that you can use after the webinar. We've done some other webinars that do focus on some of the more particular things, and I'll link to those. And watching the results come in here. Okay, so a majority of people are looking for kind of general pest management strategies. We'll give it a few more minutes if you guys want to keep filling that out. I see answers are still coming in. And I will get started with kind of my, let's see. Oh, I can, okay. So we're going to go through all of these steps in an integrated pest management sort of decision-making process. This is the framework that we always use, whether it's an organic or conventional farm, just the steps that we go through to make sure we know what the pest is we're talking about. We have some preventive controls that we can use. If those don't work, we move to a biological control if possible. And then the last step is a chemical control. And that's where, if you are a conventional grower who's thinking of transitioning to organic, that's the biggest difference for you will be just the options, the chemical control options. So I'm going to end the poll, show you the results while I close the window. Hopefully there's less background noise. They're doing some construction here today. Okay, so it's a big topic. I did want to say, for those of you who are looking for like specific pest management recommendations, maybe pop in the chat like what the crop and pest is that you're struggling with. And I also want to mention that through this program with NOFA and UMass Extension, we are offering, first there's a mentor-mentee part of the program where if you're a beginning organic farmer or looking to transition to certified organic, you can link up with a mentor farm who can help you through that process and just getting started. And we're also offering kind of one-on-one consultations. So if you go through the webinar and still have questions, just let us know. I think there's a survey at the end where you can put that information and we'll get in touch with you or get in touch with us. We'll have the contact info at the end. So those are other options where we can talk a little more about specific pests. And I did try to pop in some of the big ones that I often get questions about this time of year, especially. Okay, so the first step is, I'll say I did have a hard time figuring out where the beginning of this kind of circle is, but start with identifying the pests. So it might seem obvious, you have to get out and look at the crops, but it's hard to make time to do this. We hear this from folks all the time, and sometimes it involves crawling around on your hands and knees with a hand lens to see some of the smaller things and be able to catch them before they are at a level that's going to be hard to come back from, especially on an organic farm where you have fewer kind of chemicals to knock populations down quickly. So let's play some games. These are two cabbage plants with kind of similar symptoms. Who thinks this might be like a nutrient deficiency or irrigation problem, or maybe there's a pest happening, and maybe you could put some ideas in the chat. Seeing all of these pests. Oh, Allison got it. So this is, sorry about that. So many screens. So on the left, we have fusarium wilt, which is a soil-borne fungal disease that infects the roots and prevents water and nutrients from getting in there. And on the right, we have an insect, cabbage root maggot, that feeds on the root and similarly prevents the plant from getting nutrients and water. And this is a very classic symptom with this discoloration. I need to find a pointer, don't I? Yeah, this discoloration is a very classic symptom of cabbage root maggot damage. And that's one of the first vegetable pests we see in the spring. So first week of May, we'll start looking for that pest, and we have a little more information about that. What about this? If you were walking around scouting your brassicas, these two pictures were taken on the same day, on the same field. How many people think they're the same disease? Oh, it's a little awkward to play these games on Zoom, so we'll cut to the chase. Okay, so on the left, we have brassica downy mildew on turnip, or rutabaga, can't remember. And this is black rot, a bacterium that enters through the edge of the leaf. And someone said flea beetle, often flea beetles carry this bacterial disease externally. So I have a couple more of these little games, but my point is that if you're walking around the field, these things can be hard to tell apart. So here are two diseases of cucumbers or squash. On the left is the bacterial disease, and on the right, an OMRI-approved disease, Phytophthora abscessi. And I think I have one more. Yeah, so let's get an insect in there. These two beetles look very similar, and even their eggs look really similar. But when you have them side by side, you can tell this one's a little more like rusty orange and your classic ladybug red. So on the left, Mexican bean beetle, which is a pest of beans. And on the right, a beneficial insect that will eat aphids and other pests. So just a plug for getting things diagnosed in the lab. We have a plant diagnostic lab here at UMass. There's also one at Maine and UConn at UNH. So if you're from another state, that might be closer. Ours costs $50 a sample, and sometimes our team, the vegetable team, has some grant funding we can use to help folks kind of subsidize that cost because it can add up. So you can also just get in touch with us. We also have lots of fact sheets on our website. We have print resources, but these are also available online. So this resource is available online at the Vegetable Guide website. You can sign up for our newsletter. We have weekly pest alerts. So if you know what we're seeing around Massachusetts, that could help tip you off of, oh, that's probably that weird caterpillar that I'm seeing on my farm. And also, this is something that I just learned like last year. If you are Googling and want to sort of filter through the vastness of the internet, you can do a site.edu search, and that'll pull up more of the sort of extension resources that are can be trusted. And so when you're out there identifying things in the field, it's important, like with the ladybug, to be able to identify these beneficial insects, because some of them look really strange. This is a immature ladybug larva, looks like a little alien. This is a syrphid fly larva, also just looks like a weird booger, but both of these things eat lots of aphids. There are parasitic wasps out there naturally in the environment that can control aphids, and so we want to also be aware of what these look like at the different stages. So this is kind of what I consider to be the holy grail of identifying natural enemies of vegetable insect pests, just as the name would suggest. So you can find this online, you can buy it. I recommend getting a copy of it and just Google that title, or this QR code will take you here. Okay, so once you know what you're looking for, we recommend folks do some scouting, getting off the tractor or making time maybe on the weekend to go out and just take a deeper look at what's going on. So this is kind of a systematic way of assessing a pest population level, either by counting individuals, which is what we're doing here, counting onion thrips on onions, and that's because we have established thresholds where, you know, if we have more than one thrip per onion leaf, we probably need to do something about that. So we have these scouting sheets on our website that help you do this, and I'll link to those later. But the idea is to take a random sample of the field, and on a lot of small farms, this might not make as much sense what I'm about to describe, but we do this to efficiently take a random sample of the field. And the reason why is that our eyes tend to gravitate towards the big bad bugs, like Colorado potato beetle or something, like or the damage. You see plants that are like skeletonized or like covered in larvae, but a lot of these things come in from the field edge or from last year's potato field. So they might be concentrated in an area. And if you look at the whole field and take a random sample, you might find that in this example, if you were to only look along this edge of the field, you'd see that it was almost 80% infected. But if you sample the whole field and got 17 out of 42 plants, that's only 40%. So if your threshold for this particular bug was 50%, then you wouldn't need to spray, even though it might look bad over here. So if you did, you could do a spot treatment here or just concentrate your effort squishing in one area. So this is why taking a random sample is helpful. And these are the scouting sheets we have. So if you just go to our website here, which is ag.umass.edu/vegetable, there's a resources tab. It's the scouting resources. So these forms tell you how, when, and how to look for the major pests of, in this case, brassicas. And it gives a certain number of plants to check and what to look for. And then you would calculate how many you have in your sample. And if you're over, say, this damage threshold, or for caterpillars, we have pretty good thresholds for those too. So along with scouting comes monitoring. And Jean-Michel, if there are questions I should pay attention to in the chat, let me know.
Will do.
So we use these kind of pheromone traps. We have a network of these traps across the state that we report in veg notes each week. These are specifically for monitoring insect pests of corn and also squash vine borer. This is kind of an old school trap for catching spotted wing Drosophila that I don't think we recommend necessarily doing anymore. In the fruit world, there are a lot of these pheromone traps that you can set up in your own orchard, but you don't have a lot of great pheromone traps for vegetable pests outside of corn. So I recommend using these simple yellow sticky cards. And if you put these right in the crop and you know what you're looking for, this can give you kind of a first notice that the pest has arrived. This is a very ugly trap that's probably been out in the field too long, covered in dirt. But here's there's also some online tools. This is the NUA network for weather applications. It's a website that Cornell hosts, and it has all kinds of weather data. Like if you don't have your own rain gauge or weather station on your farm, you can go there and look up how much rain you got. If there was a storm yesterday, for example, but there are also these disease models or other pest models. These are the ones that I know of for vegetable pests. So we use the cucurbit downy mildew one a lot. There's also a tomato disease cast. We use the cabbage maggot forecast a lot, and I think I have an example of how to do this in the next couple of slides. But it uses the weather data and information that we know about how these pests, how the weather influences their behavior, and then it gives you a prediction of whether or not the pest will be active on a certain date in your location. So in the case of cabbage root maggot, this is again a pest that we expect to start seeing in the next month. So I showed you earlier that picture of the discolored cabbage plant that was wilting. This was a trial that we did a long time ago where if we didn't treat the plants, we had a lot of just plant death from that feeding damage. And this was a conventionally treated one where we had much better survival. You've probably seen this on root crops, like especially hawker-eye turnips get very ugly very quickly when you have a cabbage root maggots feeding. So on those transplants, they were feeding on the roots that supply water to the leaves and causing wilt. Here, they're causing direct damage to the harvested root. So this is a fly pest, and this is what the fly looks like on the yellow sticky card. In early May, they start laying these little eggs next to the base of the plant, and this is the tip of a pencil, and it seems like looking for a needle in a haystack, but you can get pretty good at this pretty quick, finding these eggs. When they hatch into the immature maggot stage, this is what they look like. Yuck. So here's again just a card just covered with these flies, and so we know when these flies emerge in the spring, they overwinter in the soil as pupae, and then at a certain what we call growing degree days, they begin emerging basically after a certain amount of time and heat. So you can guess this by the time that yellow rocket, that weed with yellow flowers, starts to flower on like sides of the field or road edges. But there's also one of these online models. So I just want to use this as an example of, but again, we report this in pest alerts in our newsletter, so you can also just check there. But so based on the accumulated heat over 40 degrees Fahrenheit, we know that after 450 of those degree days have passed will be the peak flight of those adult flies emerging from the soil. And when you plug in your location and say the date, this was a long time ago now, but May 15th, we could see that we were already over, we reached 450 on May 13th. So we were into, down here, this is 50% emergence, which is peak flight. So that tells you that the adults are out, they're flying, they're laying eggs, and it's a really important time to be paying attention to that pest. So that was one example of an online pest model. So that's kind of the scouting, monitoring, and identification. And now we'll get into our preventive control strategies. So here, again, we're just going through the basic tools, and then we'll use some examples of specific pests along the way. All right, so under prevention, we have things like choosing the right location that's sunny enough, that has wind flowing through, planting with the wind so that your plants can dry out, using crop rotation so that pests aren't building up in one area, and then you're planting right into that. Cover cropping, soil health, having active soil, beneficial soil microbes and arthropods to feed on or outcompete pathogens and insect pests and support healthy plants. And yeah, taking care of the plants. We have a slide about this later, but you can't have pests without healthy plants. A weed is just a plant that's growing somewhere that you don't want it. A caterpillar is just a caterpillar until it's eating your crops, and then it's a pest. So, so keeping the plants healthy is also an important part of pest control. Plants have their own immune systems, so they can tolerate a certain amount of pest pressure when given the chance. So other tools like mulching you see here, and using resistant varieties, that's a big theme in our lab. Here's this is a place where I think soil health tends to be least healthy in our high tunnels, where we're growing constantly and tilling a lot. And so here's an example of cover cropping inside a tunnel. So another, some of our preventive controls are just physical and mechanical things. So squishing bugs, using row covers, bird netting, other traps and things to just physically keep pests out. Here's sort of another example of keeping pests out of the soil by steaming. So this is kind of a newer, well, it's not new, but people are interested in it again after having a lot of high tunnels that are like 10 years old, and this pests have built up in there. So they're steaming the soil here to eradicate not only pathogens and insects, but also weeds. So here is a picture of an unsteamed tunnel of winter spinach covered in chickweed and a steamed tunnel. So often when we say pest management, people think about the insects, but we're also talking about diseases and weeds here. So some of our other physical controls for weed management, this is probably the most obvious examples of physical or mechanical control of pests. It's just cultivating, hoeing. It's very old practice, just physically removing those pests. I mentioned resistant varieties, so especially on organic farms, I think this is one of the most important things you can do is look for varieties with resistance to common diseases. So here These tomatoes are resistant to late blight, alternaria, which is early blight, and also septoria. They often have viral resistance as well. There's a lot of viruses that affect tomatoes. So just here's side by side, just pretty striking. Definitely high tunnel tomatoes are, really important to plant varieties that have resistance to powdery mildew and leaf mold, which are just impossible to control otherwise. And the resistant varieties do a really good job. This is something we look at a lot on our team. This is a trial looking at different varieties of cucumbers that have resistance to downy mildew, which when it comes in usually mid-August in our area in Massachusetts, just kind of wipes out the plants in a matter of weeks. So our colleague on Long Island, Meg McGrath, published extensive lists of resistant varieties, and she recently retired last year, so these will start to get out of date. I don't know if anyone's planning to keep them up to date, but for now, they're pretty up to date and just lots of different crops. You can get there from this QR code or just Googling around, but they are a little hard to find. Okay, that's my plug for resistant varieties. Other physical controls, just excluding the pests, obviously row covers. So here's our traditional kind of remay. This is a little fuzzy maybe on the screen here, but lots of flea beetle damage outside the cover. Under the cover, the crop is clean, but you see there's the trade-off, maybe there's a lot of weeds in there. So managing covers is labor intensive and difficult and frustrating, but they are basically 100% effective. So whatever you can do to manage the weeds and when using covers is important. That's getting easier with better and better exclusion netting. So this is rather than like a tightly spun fabric, this is a fine mesh. You can see through the mesh here, so you can see if the weeds are getting bad under there. They're using a lot of leaf mulch here to keep weeds down. The wind goes right through it, so this time of year when it can be pretty windy, it doesn't go sailing away like the remake can. So here they're just got a few sandbags holding it down there. Here's using the netting inside a tunnel. I've also certainly seen people use the netting on the side walls and end walls of the tunnel to keep pests out of the whole tunnel. So I was going to take a quick moment to talk through a very common pest that we did get. Some folks listed questions in their registration form. So leaf miners in Swiss chard and beets were one that came up, and another one that's coming up soon. So we have a pest calendar. This is our Google calendar. It's on our website as a PDF that you can print out and have on your farm and enter when you see these different pests. So the first one here, May 1st, allium leaf miner, and a bunch of others on asparagus, for example. And then leaf miner here around May 15th. So just like cabbage root maggot, we know when this, again, is another fly pest. We know when they're going to emerge. They have two peaks. One, this says mid-June. I should say mid-May. Sorry. So one in mid-May and then another in late July. So if you know something about the pest, you've identified it correctly, you can learn about its biology on our fact sheets and stuff. You know that there are these two peaks, so you could use that information to get the timing of the covers right. So you only have to have them on there for maybe 2 weeks if you're just trying to keep these leaf miners out. Maybe you put them on May 1st and you take them off the end of May, maybe just to be safe. You learn to recognize the eggs. So on the underside of the leaf here, again, this seems tiny and like looking for a needle in a haystack, but they're so bright white, and they always lay them side by side like this in a group of like 5 or so. And there might be 1 cluster on the leaf, and there might be 5 or 10 clusters on the leaf. And every one of those eggs is going to turn into a tiny little maggot that feeds in between the layers of the leaves here. That's what you see, these little mines. And so by removing the leaves or targeting the eggs, you can prevent this damage. You can do that by removing, just kind of scraping off the egg masses. It's not going to work on a big scale. At scale, you might wait for them to hatch and then just remove these leaves and actually make sure that you kill the pest inside so that it can't survive, and then your next generation in July will be that much bigger. So you can kind of over time reduce the size of the population surviving on your farm. So some farms I've worked with will pull the leaves off and put them in the trash. Other farms will just squish them with their hands. Others have piled the leaves up in drive roads and driven over them to kill pests inside. That's sort of satisfying to me. If you're at a larger scale, you can spray Entrust, which is an OMRI-approved spinosad product, and you need to target the eggs, because once the larvae are in between the layers of the leaf, the pesticide isn't going to get to them. And so you're really targeting the eggs, which again are on the underside of the leaf. So if you don't have the technology to spray very effectively the underside of the leaf, this might be not as effective for you. If you add oil, like petroleum oil, sometimes, there's a bunch of different brand names out there. That also helps to suffocate the eggs. The larva is in there. It needs to breathe, actually. So if you just smother it, that's another way that you can kill the insect inside the egg. So that's one example of my specific recommendations for spinach, beet, and Swiss chard leaf miner. Another cultural control or preventive control that we have used successfully, it's been used a lot in cucurbits for striped cucumber beetle. Here's an example using it for flea beetle. So this is the idea of taking advantage of host preference. So the insect has a preference for some brassicas more than others. It likes flea beetles in this example, like the spicier and more tender brassicas compared to these waxy brassicas, like kale and cabbage. You've probably noticed this, arugula and bok choy get a lot more flea beetle than your kale, which you might see the feeding mostly just around the edge where there's less of that wax. So anyway, you can either plant a trap crop like a mustard cover crop, which is, a little cheaper seed, or you can use, just play with the way that your crops are planted out in the field. So on this farm, they used their bok choy as a trap crop, and they sprayed Surround, which is a light kaolin clay, on the seedlings, and the flea beetles just don't like getting it on their bodies, and so it's kind of just a repellent, but it helps these waxy brassicas to get established, and once they start developing that wax, they can defend themselves a lot better. So this was kind of like a push-pull system. So the bok choy is pulling the beetles to it, and then this surround clay is pushing the beetles even more onto the bok choy. The trick is here that you have to really be on top of spraying the bok choy so it doesn't look like this. So how do you do that? Here are some of my other suggestions for flea beetles, which were another question that came up in the registration. So starting with this kaolin clay, I think is a good idea. Mulches and intercropping can help. This has been shown a lot over and over in scientific research that flea beetles just get confused and kind of leave the field if they land on something that's not a host all of a sudden. I don't know exactly the mechanism of the mulches, but the flea beetles go up and down into the soil all day, and then they come out and feed and then go back into the soil to cool off, I guess. I don't know. They lay their eggs in the soil. So that just kind of disrupts their moving around and they get confused and leave. They're not very smart, it turns out. But then if you're gonna spray, and Trust has been shown to be the most effective against flea beetles. This has been done over and over and over. And partially I think it's because Trust kills insects by ingestion. So they have to feed on it and then they're killed. So when you spray Entrust on leaves, it stays there for 5 to 7 days. So flea beetle comes, eats a little bit of leaf and dies. And then the next day, more flea beetles are just going to keep coming. So the Entrust provides this residual protection. You should use an adjuvant like a spreader sticker, and there are OMRI-approved spreader stickers. New Film P is one, Attach is one, and lots of them out there. But that helps the spray to stick to the leaf instead of just rolling off these waxy leaves. So, so that's kind of the first chemical line of defense, but you've got to read the label. There are some limitations. You can't spray it over and over and over again. I think you only have 2 applications and then you have to rotate to something else. So Pyganic, that is a pyrethrin, and again, OMRI approved. And that kills the beetles on contact. And so you can use it to quickly knock the population back, but there's no residual and it breaks down pretty quickly in the sun. So they'll just come right back. So you kind of can mix these or alternate these two. And again, those have been shown to be the 2 most effective over and over. People ask a lot about using nematodes for flea beetles. So like I said, they lay eggs in the soil and those larvae feed on the roots. They're very, very tiny. They don't usually cause much damage on the roots, but there are beneficial nematodes that feed on insects. And so in a sort of greenhouse or pot setting, you can show that these work. We've actually shown that you can they can work in the field, but the effect is so small. There are so many flea beetles on so many wild and weedy brassica plants and farms. They're just gonna keep coming in from outside. So if you're only killing the larvae in the soil in your crop row, it's not very efficient. It's expensive. And also it doesn't do anything about the active beetles currently eating your crop. And they have like 4 or 5 generations per year. They're going to keep coming in from outside. So don't really recommend it just because of that sort of landscape scale effect. Nematodes do work for other things, and we have a whole other webinar about that.
Okay, so we
So,
got one question, kind of related to that. Can pyrethrin, spinosad, BT, and a compost tea or something like Neptune's Harvest be all mixed together in a backpack sprayer?
yeah, theoretically, you could mix things together in a backpack. I would recommend to read through the labels because sometimes they are not very compatible. One thing might have some kind of additive that affects the other and it'll cause it to like precipitate out of solution or something, or foam a lot, you see. So they recommend this jar test. So just mix it up in a little mason jar and shake it. And if it looks like there isn't any precipitate or foam, then you can go ahead and spray. That being said, yeah, I can see a situation where you might want to mix all of them together, but thinking strategically about why you're using this or that, and are you targeting the right stage of the pest at the right time? And so we'll kind of get to that later, but and we also have a whole other webinar on insect pest management for organic growers. So I did kind of try to steer a little bit away from most of the insect stuff, but we will talk about it briefly. So in that example, something like the brassicas are an example where the BT is a pesticide that affects caterpillars. The spinosad or entrust is something that affects insects that feed on the leaf. So that could be flea beetles or caterpillars. And then the pyganic is something that kills things on contact. So that could be flea beetles and caterpillars and maybe a little bit aphids. So you could mix them all together because you might have all three of those things happening at the same time in a brassica field. But generally, I'd want to think pretty carefully about doing that versus, maybe mixing two one week, using the third on the second week, and then doing another combination so that you're kind of rotating through the materials. Okay, so how are we doing on time here? Wow, am I talking too fast? It's a
Seems
lot
good
to
to me.
cover. Okay. So we'll go through biological control and then some chemical control, and then I think we'll have a lot of time for questions. If I caught this right. So biological control is the idea of using one organism to control another organism. So using natural enemies, the easiest examples of this maybe are in insects, but there's also, like we just talked about, nematodes that attack insects, fungi that attack insects, bacteria and fungi that attack other bacteria and fungi. So, and then weeds have biocontrols, or either insects or diseases that can control weeds. So there's kind of two ways to think about this. One is like releasing these into your system, and the other is just like encouraging native beneficial insects to come closer to your crops. So we'll give a couple examples of that. If you guys grow beans organically, you've probably seen bean beetles. These are those rusty orange ladybug looking guys that feed directly on the leaves. So this is kind of some of that. Here's some of the beetle damage. They lay their eggs on the underside of the leaf. Those are those pale yellow eggs that again look like ladybug eggs. And when they hatch, beetle larvae are insane looking. This is the larval stage, the immature stage. They look like spiky yellow boogers, and they cause this like rough damage and can really impact the yield just because of the leaf damage, but they also feed directly on the pods and yeah, bad scene. It also tends to be bad because a lot of folks do beans as a pick your own crop with multiple successions all in the same area. Your pick your own fields are often in the same area. year after year. So these can really develop, build up to high populations. So there is a parasitic wasp that attacks these guys, and but it doesn't survive the winter here in Massachusetts currently. Maybe someday it would, I don't know. But this is the tiny wasp, and it lays an egg inside the larva of the bean beetle. When it's parasitized, it turns brown. So inside this brown, we call it a mummy, because it's dead inside, a new adult wasp will emerge, mate, lay lots of more eggs that will infect other bean beetle larvae. So we've worked with a couple of farms to optimize this. It takes a little bit of work on your part to get the timing of it right. You have to order the bugs, get them, and put them out in the field. So it's a little bit of work on your part, but if you establish it early in the season with the first generation, then which you could find on that pest calendar, then the generations of wasps will increase over the whole summer, and you'll have more and more and more wasps. So as you're planting successions of beans, you'll be having more successions of wasps controlling the beetles. Hope that makes sense. That's kind of the premise of this insect biocontrol. And we use it in greenhouses a lot. And as we do more vegetable production in high tunnels, we're experimenting with how effective are these greenhouse biocontrol organisms in the field or in these high tunnels. So here's another example. This is mite damage on cucumbers. So this white stippling. And if you zoom in on the underside of the leaf, this is what the two-spotted spider mite looks like, and their eggs. They are favored by dry, hot conditions. This is a very advanced case, but there are predators. So these are mites that eat other mites. This some mite on mite.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a couple different species of predatory mites. Some are generalist mite feeders and some are targeted on the two-spotted spider mite. So those might be best if you have like an outbreak of two-spotted spider mite, and this might be better maintaining a low population once that's under control. Here are some OMRI-approved chemical controls that I might recommend here. Oils and insecticidal soaps. So those are things that just kind of smother the insects, and that's how they die. There is also Bovaria bassiana, which one name for that is mycotrol. It's a fungus that attacks some soft-bodied insects, and it's a fungus, so it does have some environmental parameters under which it works best. So that's like more moisture, not super bright sunny. So it's not necessarily that going to be that effective in a tunnel, but I did read that some of the new plastics have like UV blocking characteristics, so that and that they saw some improvement in the survival and infection with Bovaria in tunnels that had those treatments or types of plastic. So aphids are a big problem, and we're already seeing these in greenhouses and high tunnels. Helps to have a hand lens for all of this identification. Also, we're here as a resource if you want to send us pictures or samples, but there are some tricks you can use to identify, like these little tailpipes can be diagnostic, and like the dent in their forehead can be helpful. So things like that, or just give us a call. So there's lots of different biocontrols for aphids. These are some of the ones that you can purchase from places online like Arbico or IPM Labs or many others that I can't think of off the top of my head. It's a little complicated. We have a lot of fact sheets and resources on how to do it. And if you're interested in this, that's something we might work on through that mentorship or consultation approach. But there's also, like I said, lots of naturally occurring beneficial insects out in the environment that you can just kind of encourage to come closer to your crops. Again, ladybugs and their larvae, which again, make sure you know what those look like. Syrphid flies can eat a lot of their larvae. They don't eat any aphids, they're flies, but they're, this is the syrphid fly larva, which can eat a lot of aphids. So here's an example. This is Appleton Farm in Ipswich, where they're growing flowers that are attractive to syrphid flies and other beneficial insects right under their very well pruned tomato high tunnel crop. And you can do that in the field as well. So this idea of conserving natural enemies, you do have to kind of tolerate a low level of infestation all the time. If you use pesticides and wipe out all the natural, all the pests and all the natural enemies, you'll end up with a resurgence in the pests or just some other new pest coming in its place. So if you're doing this, be conscientious about how you're using chemical controls more so than ever. Yeah, so alyssum is pictured here, but also dill, wild carrot, and marigold are some of the like classic insectary flowers that you could plant. That's what I was going to say about biological control. And yes, good point about emerging under the cover. As folks are doing more like permanent beds and no-till, a lot of insects overwinter in high residue areas we call like the field edge, the weedy part of the field where it's not getting tilled all the time, or like bare ground. But as we have these permanent beds with lots of mulch, that area is just as conducive as any field edge to overwintering for a lot of these pests. So you could end up with pests emerging underneath the covers. So that's where like rotation is important. So if you have fall beets and you had a lot of leaf miner there, those leaf miner pupae are going to pupate right in the soil. They're going to drop to the soil and pupate there. So definitely don't plant your spring Swiss chard in the same bed. Plant any other, those leaf miners don't affect any brassicas or any other crops. So same with flea beetles. If you know, you put your spring brassicas as far as you can from your fall brassicas. And then like Jean-Vive said in the chat, if you do want to cover things and you have some of those areas where you suspect the pest might emerge under there was a picture a few slides back of a farm that had put the yellow sticky cards underneath the covers. And so that A, gives you a sense of, are they emerging under there? And B, you might be able to just use enough cards that you trap them out. So if you catch every single one on a sticky card, they won't kill your plants. In the chat, I see what crop to recommend for flea beetle trap crop. So you could use something that's not really a cash crop. So like a mustard cover crop seed and plant like a strip of that every so many beds. We did that with a very large organic brassica grower, and we planted direct seeded mustard, cover crop seed, every so many beds. And then we were trying to draw the insects there and kill them. But they were planting in blocks of like 8 beds of kale and then 4 beds of bok choy. And they were just going to the bok choy. So we ended up, instead of maintaining this whole other crop using this different planting equipment, and managing the mustard, we just ended up, if we just spray the bok choy, we don't have to spray the other 8 beds of kale. So in that way, we were reducing the amount of pesticide going out, the amount of time it took, and still getting very good control. So those are, I hope, 2 different examples of trap cropping. And then in the cucurbits for straight cucumber beetle, that beetle carries a bacterial disease which causes wilt in cucurbits, especially like cucumbers and some squash. And the beetles prefer some cucurbits over others. And so in conventional settings, they've used this pretty successfully, where you can plant the more preferred, say blue Hubbard, kind of a classic example of this, and then just spray that, and then all the rest of your plants will be protected because all the beetles will go to the blue Hubbard. But again, you have to kill them on the trap crop or else they just become a source of more bugs. I don't have anything on potato beetle, and I'm going to skip it for now. I don't think there is a good biocontrol for potato beetle. Is a short answer to that question, unfortunately. Okay, so we are into the chemical control section, which I think people did have a fair number of questions about. So this is the last step. You've tried everything else. You know what the pest is for sure. You know something about its life cycle. When is it most susceptible to being sprayed? You need to spray the leaf, or is it in the soil? And is it causing economic damage? Potato beetle is a good example of this because potato plants can actually tolerate quite a bit of defoliation by potato beetles before you see any impact on yield. It's like 40% or something defoliation. So that's where the scouting comes into play. Are you actually at a damaging level of the pest? And so what are OMRI-approved pesticides? They are considered reduced risk because they either break down quickly in the environment, they have lower toxicity, and so less harmful to beneficial insect. They have short days to harvest and pre-harvest intervals, but they tend to be pretty broad spectrum. They aren't, except for BT, might be an example of, where that is pretty specific. So, but they're still pesticides. And what does that mean? They're designed to kill. And in the case of insecticides, they're designed to kill animals. So a lot of these things affect like the nervous system, and we also have a nervous system. So I think there has been, sometimes, I thought that they're organic, so they're safe, but they still have sometimes warning labels, sometimes danger, poison labels. In the case of copper, you're required to follow the label, which in the case of entrust, you need to wear coveralls, chemical resistant gloves, and shoes and socks. Something I don't always see out in the field. It has a 4-hour re-entry interval. So after you spray it, you're not supposed to go into that area for 4 hours unless you have training and PPE. And there are other rules that come with using pesticides on the farm that if you don't undergo any training, you might miss. Like you're supposed to train your workers on worker protection, safety, and that's a law. So it's good to be aware of those things, and I think, and I have a slide coming up with some resources how to get that training, but that's something we offer at UMass, or you can do online. There, the EPA has resources too. So this is just pointing out this box that tells you the PPE and REI. So how do you know what to use? There are a couple of good resources. New York State IPM maintains a list of these organic production guides. So there's a lot of different ones for vegetables. This is just one example. So this gives a lot of information on how to grow brassicas, but also how to manage the insect and disease pests organically. So it'll rate like neem oil versus BT versus entrust for the different pests. Similarly, this resource guide for organic insect and disease management is like required reading, I think, for any organic farmer that is interested in chemical control of insects and diseases. Again, it has the first half is like, how do these things work? Which is important. Like, you will be more successful using these things if you know how they work. And then they rate their efficacy on different pests. And unfortunately, a lot of these things, the efficacy is very variable. So if you look at this, you'll see it'll say one study found it was poor, 2 studies found it was good, 1 study found it was excellent. And so what do you do with that data? I think I've tried to various ways over the years tried to find ways to distill this down, and I will say we have another webinar that goes into modes of action and stuff a little more in depth, and I'm not going to go into that so much today. I'm going to try not to and talk more about the pest biology, and then the vegetable management guide, which is also free online, but that gives a description of all the pests and then what pesticides are listed or registered for them. And there will be a little OG symbol next to the ones that are OMRI-approved. And then there's like tables that list just the OMRI-approved ones. So check those resources out. Thanks, Anne. Good point. Okay, so I think, yeah, it's very important to understand something about the insect biology. We talked about timing and using the pest calendar. So for insects, how are they feeding? What kind of damage are they causing? So we have piercing, sucking insects, like, okay, so mosquitoes, that's a familiar example, but also aphids and mites, chewing, beetles and caterpillars come to mind. And then rasping mouth parts, so thrips cause this kind of just like a grater or zester on the onion leaves, causing this damage. Picture there. What is their life cycle? So beetles, caterpillars, and flies have complete metamorphosis. So what do the eggs look like? What does the immature stage look like? And what does the adult and pupa look like? Where is this pest in its life cycle in my field right now? If I've waited too long to spray for caterpillars and brassicas, and then I finally get around to spraying with entrust, but they've all dropped to the ground or formed a chrysalis on the leaf, then it's not going to be effective. So, yeah, this is my, I went backwards. This is my plug for understanding the insect biology. So is it hard or soft bodied? Is it above or below ground? Where is it causing damage? Is it blowing in from somewhere else, or is this overwintering in my field? And that, in that case, I think the ones that overwinter in your field are generally ones that you can have more of an impact on, for better or worse. Like if you don't take care of them, they might build up. Or if you spray the same thing all the time, they might build up resistance to that. Like in the case of entrust for Colorado potato beetle, certainly seen that on many organic farms. So I just listed some of the major vegetable insect pests under kind of their order. And we, like I mentioned, we did another webinar a little bit more in depth on OMRI-approved insecticides and how they work. And all of the webinars we record and put on our YouTube channel and on the past events page on our website, so you can hopefully always find them there. Okay, so here's, I think I went through this a little bit earlier, but I was, okay, I didn't save my work. I started trying to throw in a quick slide about flea beetle control because it was important, but I have some take-home messages about that later on. I want to talk a little bit about plant diseases because something exciting at UMass Extension is we now have a weed specialist and an insect specialist on our team. So I used to try and talk about all those things, and my training is actually in plant pathology, so I was excited to think about leaving some of that out, although I already spent a lot of time talking about insects and weeds, and talk a little bit about diseases. So these are kind of the understanding what organism is causing the disease can be helpful managing them in the field. They behave differently. Here's a list of common vegetable diseases by their these are like kingdoms, fungi and bacteria. And then we have oomycetes, which are, if I go back, oops, are over here with like the, what are they called? Looking at John, yeah. Anyway, they evolved in the ocean and they're more similar to like seaweed.
You're like brown algae or something.
Yeah, something like that. All right, so bacteria are, and this is the evolutionary tree of life. So the oldest, simplest things down here and the more complicated things up here. So bacteria are single-celled organisms. They can't really move around very well on their own, except for in water. They have this flagella where they can kind of swim around. So they're also very, very small, like a micron. And so this is a scanning electron microscope, and this is a stomata on a plant leaf, and this is bacteria passively entering an open stomate. So they can't really infect the plant themselves. They have to get in through an opening. So here's black rot in brassicas. It gets sucked in to these veins through the hydathodes, which is just where the veins end at the edge of the leaf. And I want to point out that here's our friend, the flea beetle, brassica flea beetle, and they can also spread bacterial cells on their bodies. And so sometimes the best way to control a disease is actually to control the insect that is helping spread it. So these bacterial cells, they are mostly exist in the plant sap or in water. And so they're splashing from plant to plant, especially when it rains, or if the plants are wet and people moving around in there. That's how bacteria kind of spread. They don't really survive on their own in soil. And they don't spread in the wind like fungi. They cause spots when they're splashed onto the leaf or the fruit. they can get into the plant sap either through insects or yeah, passively through wounds or other openings. And from the seeds, sometimes systemic infections originate from within or on the seed. And so bacteria thrive in warm, humid, or wet conditions, whereas fungi are cooler, tend to be cooler. So that was kind of, yeah, a bunch of our bacterial diseases, spots and specks and wilts. So again, fungi is its own whole kingdom, but all of the plant pathogens fall in these two groups. And they behave similarly, or there's kind of like broadly a couple categories of these fungal disease, but things like this is Cercospora on beets, anthracnose fungi, alternarias on various hosts. This is on brassicas. This is white mold on beans, and all the powdery mildews are fungi. So they exist as like mycelia. So this is Rhizoctonia characteristic. It's usually just moves around as hyphae growing through the soil, growing through the plant, on the plant residue. That white mold, this white stuff there, that's mycelia. And then they make spores. So they have asexual and sexual spores. It's not that important. Usually these asexual spores, well, both of them can be diagnostic. So here are some of the common things that we see. Botrytis, this is an anthracnose fungus. And these spores, importantly, can be spread by wind, as well as water and rain splash. But and then here again is infected seed. So this is not like a truly seed-borne thing. This is just like contaminating the exterior of the seed. So, and here's some spores and chains there. Here is fruit rots. So sometimes spores are spread by wind, but they can also be spread on the fruit as it's being shipped around. There are soil-borne diseases that can be spread through soil. They survive in the crop residues typically better than bacteria, and sometimes they have special overwintering structures that can help them live for a long time. So again, in the case of white mold, these black sclerotia, as they're called, they're just hard structures that allow the pathogen, the fungus, to survive for 8 or 10 years in the soil and emerge when conditions are favorable. And in general, fungi are a little cooler, but they still need a lot of moisture. Usually, like leaf wetness favors fungal disease, but there's always an exception to the rule. And the exception to the leaf wetness is the powdery mildews, which just like humidity. So the best way to manage these is to well, start with clean seed. This is a picture, this is a very common sight, I feel. Folks leave their brassicas over the winter, but there's like alternaria growing all over this thing. So if you just disc this up and then you plant your spring transplants down the road, I don't know, there's a lot of alternaria spores kicking around. If you can mow this or disc this in the fall, it's always better. So you don't have that, what we sometimes call a green bridge. And then anything you can do to reduce moisture. So increasing plant spacing can help a lot. Sometimes it's just too tight in there. And then if you have weeds, it's just very, very wet and diseases really thrive in those conditions. Avoiding overhead irrigation is key. And then you can manage these sometimes Copper is going to be the most effective for both bacterial and fungal diseases on an organic farm. There's lots of different coppers, and there are some safety concerns around copper that I think I have a slide about later. And then there are a lot of biofungicides and like plant immune boosters that are labeled. And it becomes a little murky to really tease out if those are working all the time in the fields on the leaf surface for these leaf spots especially. We have oomycetes, and again, so just thinking about how these things behave differently. Here's my picture of brown algae and diatoms, which are similar to these oomycetes that look like fungi because they have mycelia and spores, but they behave differently. They have these sporangia, which can be spread by the wind. And that's an important way that these things get around. Some of the important oomycete diseases are late blight, which we actually haven't seen in a long time, nothing with. And all the downy mildews are oomycetes. This is Phytophthora capsicum here. Yeah, some of the damping off pathogens as well. So some in the soil, like this one here, and the damping off pathogens, while others are spreading in the air. Yeah, so this is Phytophthora capsicum or Phytophthora blight of cucurbits. So this one lives in the soil and often produces a second spore type that can swim when the field is saturated. And so when you have like a low section of the field or just a really wet year, and your soil is contaminated with this disease for one reason or another, you get this, the spores find their way to the plant roots, infect, and you have this crown rot, or like we saw in the previous slide, this fruit rot where the fruit is lying on the soil there. So these sporangia are they can be spread really long distances, like in the atmosphere. The downy mildews are darkly colored, so they survive traveling far distances. So an example of this is cucurbit downy mildew. So these are the dark spores, and on the leaf, this is what it looks like. On the underside of the leaf, this dark, so like kind of crusty. Sometimes it just looks like, oh, is there soil on there? But very characteristic downy mildew symptom. And so we use a national monitoring network to track where this disease is, because it can't survive outside of the host. So it just is blowing around, and wherever susceptible cucurbits are planted, it will start to grow. But again, we've done a lot of work on looking at resistant varieties. So again, this is the cucumber that's resistant or not, and they won't hold up forever, but usually at least like 2 extra weeks of control. And then if you combine that with spraying copper, you might get a little bit more. So we recommend planting resistant varieties, especially for the later season cucumbers. There's a lot of viruses out there. They cause similar types of symptoms. They're almost always spread by insects. And they're very hard to tell what it is for sure, unless you submit a sample to the lab and they have like similar to a COVID test for each of these different viruses. So if you have a bad virus outbreak, it's worth knowing which one it is, because they often have they affect lots of different hosts, but sometimes it's not what you would expect. It's not like always this whole family, but not this one. So it's worth knowing if you do have an outbreak of this, and we can help you figure that out. Just want to mention that there are nematodes. For farms that have this root knot nematode, it can be very frustrating. I do think people can grow through it. So it's not like a death sentence, but this is root knot nematode and it affects lots of vegetables and it's in the soil. There are, again, resistant varieties. If you have tomatoes, for example, it's good to look for rootstocks at least if you're grafting that have resistance to nematodes. Okay, so here, this is what I'll say about controlling diseases on vegetable farms is just that copper is the most effective, like I said, for bacteria and fungi. This is some copper residue on the plant. It is corrosive, it can cause skin discomfort, it can cause eye damage if you are harvesting out there and then you touch your eye or your nose. So it's something to be careful with, but it does work the best. It has some residual activity that protects the leaf from that constant barrage of spores and rain splashing bacteria. And I think that's why it's successful in controlling disease, but you need to start spraying ahead of any disease symptoms, and then you need to keep up spraying. Like tomatoes, they're going to keep growing. All of that unsprayed material is very susceptible to disease. So there's a lot of biofungicides to control disease on organic farms or conventional farms. So these are like bacteria or fungi in these cases that can be applied. This is root shield. It's a wettable powder that is, so this is 2 fungi that you put in with the soil or water into the root zone to protect plants from damping off pathogens or fusarium, those systemic fungi. This is a bacterium that you might use to control a fungal leaf spot or a bacterial leaf spot. They can also be used in the soil, and this is a plant extract that is has some plant immune system boosting properties. This is a busy slide, but these are the different ways that they work. So this is like directly a fungus attacking another fungus. These bacteria and fungi create, like all of our antibiotics come from these kinds of organisms. So these are bacteria and fungi that are making antibiotic compounds. And so when you spray them onto the plant, that's what's doing the work is those molecules. The plant recognizes them as potential threats because they, to the plant, look like bacteria. And so it kind of turns on the plant defense system. So that's another way that they can work. And then, yeah, just out-competing pathogens, either around the root or around the leaf. Okay, so this is the end of my slides. I assume there's lots of questions, but these were kind of my take-home messages for organic growers and pest management, which broadly includes insects, weeds, and diseases, and is very complicated. And that's, why we're here to help. But okay, so I just really liked this picture of this like proud celery, like standing tall. You need to have healthy crops. So sometimes people are like, is shade cloth, does that count as a pest management tool? I think yes, because if the plant is under heat stress or water stress, it's busy fighting that off and it's not fighting off an insect or a fungus. They're just more susceptible. So keep your plants as healthy as possible. I think planning ahead is a really good idea because when you're in the season, it's just, there's so much going on. If you don't know already, like where your backpack is and that it has the right nozzles and that you have the materials you need when this or that bug starts showing up, and you have to go order it, and they're out. It just helps to make a plan ahead of time. And if you want to do like a consultation, that's what we're available to do that. Make sure you identify the pests correctly. I recommend getting a hand lens and then reaching out to us. You can send us a picture, and we can help you decide, like, oh, you really should submit a sample. Sometimes we can come out to the farm and take a look. So get in touch. Keep a close eye on things, especially on an organic farm. It's really hard to catch up if like your plants are covered in aphids. Your biocontrols are going to have a hard time like getting that under control before you're seeing a lot of yield loss or quality loss. I always recommend people use exclusion netting. I know it's expensive up front, but folks are seeing it last a long time, and it really, unless you have stuff emerging under there, which you could put the sticky cards out, but it's basically 100% effective. So, and it's easier to work with than Remay. It doesn't trap heat and it doesn't blow away. We're working now with a bunch of farms on NRCS pest management plans. So folks might be familiar with working with Natural Resources Conservation Service to get technical and financial support for things like soil and water management, but they also do provide funding for pest management practices under the plant health practice. So if you have a conservation plan, ask them about exclusion netting, and if they don't know, they can talk to you. Prevention is key on organic farms because the chemical tools aren't as strong as on a conventional farm. So you really need to, like, crop rotation is going to be really huge, and resistant varieties. And I think this is our contact info. I mentioned the calendar. You can find it here. You can send us photos, or you can give a call, and we have lots of like fact sheets and stuff on our website. I don't know if Laura Davis is here. Just scrolling through. Oh, hi, Laura. If you want to maybe say a few words at this time about, there was a question about what the process of transitioning to organic is like. And this is kind of the point of this program, and we haven't really talked directly about it. So I want to give Laura Davis from NOFA Mass a chance to talk about that before we get into answering all of your questions that we have time for, if we have time for them.
Thanks, Sue. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I really appreciate partnering with UMass Extension in the TOP program, the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. And if any of you are considering transitioning, you can sign up for a organic farmer mentor for a full year. The next matching will take place in September, so you can go to organictransition.org and sign up either if you're considering. So in terms of the transition, generally, I'm helping folks walk through their paperwork to make sure that there's nothing too confusing along the way. Sometimes transition to some people means, okay, so I've been not using anything prohibitive for the last 3 years, so I think I'll go ahead and apply for certification. So it's just a matter of documenting what products have been used for the last 3 years and what has been grown for the last 3 years, and putting in your application. Other folks may think about transition in terms of reducing the amount of synthetic fertilizers and nitrogen type products on their fields, starting to put in cover crops. So transition can mean a lot of different things for different people, but we're happy to work through that with you. And all of these products and cultural practices that Sue has been talking about throughout this whole presentation have been really, really helpful. So get in touch. I'm at Laura Davis at nofamass.org if we can help you transition.
Cool. Thanks, Laura. I can't see anyone, so I'm gonna maybe stop sharing this. Yeah, if there are more questions, I'm happy to take them now, or I think we're, at the end of our time officially, so.
Susan, I had a question. So in terms of like small to mid scale, like highly diversified CSA and market farms, like how are you seeing folks kind of implement effective IPM strategies? Because it always seems like a challenge of, you know, if you're growing such a diversity of crops, like keeping up with scouting and even managing all the pests and diseases. So just curious if you see folks and what strategies they're kind of using in those settings.
Yeah, good question. It is so diverse out there, and there just seems like there's so many pests and there's always new ones. So I think working with folks, trying to focus on a few at a time has been helpful, I think. If you can identify your top 3 or top 5 issues that, or something that seems to be getting worse, or something that's, just really important to you for one reason or the other, and just trying to focus on one thing at a time. And then, over the course of a couple of years, you might have tackled 15 different things if you do 3 different things each year. Definitely reach out for help. And I think once you can think about the insect or disease and how different ones are similar, or learn what strategies are the same for different pests, then it becomes a little easier to like plug this control strategy into this pest and also this one, if that makes sense. And I think printing out the calendar would be a good idea, because the way it's set up, you can write down like when you first saw the pest on your farm, because we just kind of took like an average across the whole state. So it's going to be different in like the Southeast compared to the Berkshires. So taking notes and keeping records over time of what worked and what didn't is another important thing that I forgot to mention.
Cool. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat, Sue. We have consistently poor germination of spring peas and beans. Seed treatments for organic. Question.
Yeah. So do you think that, like, have you observed like seed corn maggots in there, or is it more like, are you inoculated? Because you could inoculate peas and beans with rhizobia.
You can unmute yourself if that's easier.
We have seen a lot of, so there's 3 different, okay, now there's 4 different spring maggot pests. It's a very gross thing to say, but it is true. They're maggot pests, and they emerge in the spring, and they like to lay their eggs in like high residue, freshly tilled over fields. So there's onion maggot and cabbage maggot, and there's also seed corn maggot. They kind of overlap in the timing. One is a little earlier than the other. But I would dig up some plants and look at their roots and find out if there are any insects in there, if the roots are just look diseased, or if it's just, the emergence. And then that could be it could be dialing in the planting depth or rate. It could also be cutworms. which are caterpillar pests that feed at night and kind of like cut there's two different types, but some of them cut the plant off, like at the soil surface. And in some years we see a lot of that, and I think we saw a lot of that last year, where it just like this, it just seems like they disappear. But you can see the little holes where they come from, so yeah, maybe that's a case where we could come out and help you do some spring scouting and figure out like what is the cause of the damage.
And then this came as a direct message to me, maybe some may not see it, but what's your recommendation for dealing with root knot in carrots?
Yeah, this came up recently and I was supposed to do some research on it and I haven't yet. I don't know right now. I'm not a nematologist, but I should know the answer. So if you want
There's
to,
like biofumigation stuff with mustard, but I don't know how recent the research is, how effective it is.
yeah, I'm like, I did just write something about this, if I could find it quickly. That maybe you want to pop your email in the chat or get in touch with us and we can help you. We can get you a better answer offline. But yeah, planting to a non-host crop, which might mean cover cropping or doing alliums in that spot. That's not a great answer, sorry. But we can
It's hard.
we can do some more digging offline. Okay, Anne Hazelrig. Anne is a diagnostician from Vermont. Great resource, and she is saying also, yeah, rotation is key for nematodes. There was a question about fertilizer safe for pets. It's not my area of expertise, but we recommend for organic growers a lot of composted manures. What am I thinking of? Yeah, chicken manure, things like feather meal, blood meal, so animal meals, but also seed meals like brassica seed meal, soybean meal, peanut meal. Those are organic soil amendment fertilizers that I don't know about the safety of pets eating them, but that's what we recommend for the plants. And we did have a webinar earlier in the series on organic fertility, so check that out if you haven't. And I don't see any other questions, so I guess we'll go ahead and log off. We have one more of these webinars before we take this out into the field, and we'll be publishing a list of upcoming field events soon, but in 2 weeks we have our last webinar, which is on food safety and sanitizers that are okay on organic farms, and that's something we do get a lot of questions about. It's not everyone's favorite topic, but when you need to clean up your washroom, you don't know exactly what to use, it's good to know. So maybe we'll see some of you there. Thanks.